Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host, Mitch. Glad to have you here. If this is your first time, let me give you a quick rundown on how the show works. Here in the Commander's Quarters, we build fun and inexpensive focused commander decks. A focused commander deck is more tuned than a casual deck, but not quite to the level of a competitive or optimized deck. Our Commander's Quarters decks are built on a $25 budget. That's $25 for 100 cards. But before we get started on today's deck tech, why don't you go hit that subscribe button to make sure that you stay up to date on the latest Commander's Quarters deck techs. Today's commander is going to be Edgar Markov. Edgar is a 4/4 vampire knight that costs 3 red, white, black. He has Eminence. Whenever you cast another vampire spell, if Edgar Markov is in the command zone or on the battlefield, create a 1/1 black vampire creature token. He also has First Strike and Haste, and whenever he attacks, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. Edgar is an amazing commander for Vampire Tribal. Not only does he help you go wide by giving you a vampire token every single time you cast a vampire, but he also helps you go tall by pumping your team whenever he attacks. So what's our strategy for this deck? Well, we want to cast cheap vampires as quickly as we can and flood the board. There are plenty of cheap and effective vampires out there, and every single time we cast one, we get an extra from Edgar. So how do we win with this deck? Well, we need to pump up our team and overwhelm our opponents with our giant vampire army. Outside of Edgar's attack trigger, there are plenty of ways for us to buff our vampire army. As with all Commander's Quarters decks, I'm going to break this deck down into 10 different tactics that show you how the deck works and how you're going to win with it. Let's go on to tactic number 1, fix it. Now with this deck, we're going to be running a ton of cheap vampires, so we don't need a lot of ramp, we just need a little bit of fixing. That's why we're running each and every single signet that we can, including Rakdos, Orzhov, and Boros. Then there's Fear the Suns, which can tap for any one of our colors, but it can only do that 3 times. Again, the goal of this deck isn't to generate a ton of mana, it's just to get creatures out quickly. And although we are running these forms of fixing, we aren't depending on them. Since we are a budget deck, we don't have access to a lot of lands that come into play untapped and fix our mana. Because of this, we're going to have to focus on one color to make sure that we can consistently and quickly cast our creatures. And since we get the most and the best vampires in black, we're going to focus on that. Let's go through some of those first vampires in tactic number 2, One Bite. Pulse Tracker and Vicious Conquistador pretty much both do the exact same thing. Whenever we attack with them, each opponent's going to lose 1 life. Gul'Draz's Vampire may not be a big threat early game, but later in the game, it can be huge. It starts off as a 1/1, but if one of our opponents has 10 or less life, it becomes a 3/2 with Intimidate. Then there's Vampire Lacerator, which immediately starts off as a threat for our opponents. It's a 2/2 for 1, and we're going to lose 1 life at the beginning of our upkeep unless an opponent has 10 or less life, but that's a price we're willing to pay. We're running plenty of life gain effects in this deck, including Vampire Cutthroat. Vampire Cutthroat has Skulk and Lifelink, so it's very easy for him to get in there and gain us some life. Then there's Vampire Neonate, which is just a good blocker for us. And if we have some extra mana available, we can pay 2 and tap it to make each opponent lose 1 life and we gain 1 life. Quag Vampires is a 1/1 with Swamp Walk, and we can actually make it bigger when we cast it by kicking it. So early game, it's very good at getting in some quick hits, but late game, we can actually make it into a bigger threat by putting some mana into it. Next up is Shadow Alley Denizen, which is good at helping us get some of our creatures through. It has whenever another black creature enters the battlefield under your control, target creature gains Intimidate until the end of the turn. Again, the vast majority of our creatures in this deck are black, so this will be activating a lot. So we talked about how we want to have a focus on just black creatures to start off with, and as you can see, every single one of these 1-drops is black. This helps us be a lot more consistent in our early turns. As you'll see in our 2-drops, we follow pretty much the exact same game plan. So let's go through some of those 2-drops in tactic number 3, 2 FANGS. Vampire Interloper and Olivia's Bloodsworn are both 2/1s with flying and they can't block. On top of that, Olivia's Bloodsworn has the ability to give a vampire haste by just paying a red. This can come in really handy later in the game when we have some extra mana lying around. Then there's Heir of Falkenrath, which is just a 2/1, but if we discard a card, we can transform her. She turns into Heir to the Night, which is a 3/2 flyer and a good early threat. Olivia's Dragoon can also gain flying, but only temporarily by discarding a card. Now we are running some Madness cards in this deck, so we can benefit from discarding cards. Next up, there's Bloodseeker, which can definitely do some work against some other aggressive creature-based strategies. It has whenever a creature enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, we can have that player lose 1 life. Going in the other direction, we've got Child of Night. Child of Night is a 2/1 with lifelink, and it can come in huge in helping us gain life and stabilize. When Carrier Thrall dies, we get to put a 1/1 colorless Eldrazi Scion token onto the battlefield that we can sacrifice for mana. So not only are we getting a creature token when this guy comes into play, we also get a creature token when it dies. Oathsworn Vampire is a creature that's going to benefit from all that life gain that we have in this deck. Because even if it dies, we can cast it from the graveyard in any turn that we gain life. Next up is Ruthless Coldblade, which isn't a threat early on in the game, but later in the game, if one of our opponents has 10 or less life, it's going to be a 4/2 for 2. Speaking of potential late game threats, there's Malakir Coldblade. It starts off as just a 1/1, but whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on it. And then there's Bloodcrazed Paladin, which can be a huge threat after a board wipe or after a big combat step. It has flash, so we can cast it whenever, and whenever it enters the battlefield, we get a +1/+1 counter on it for each creature that died that turn. Finally, there's Vampire Hexmage, which can be amazing in the right scenario. At any point, we can sacrifice it to remove all counters from target permanent. This can work against certain creatures, artifacts, enchantments, and it can even just kill planeswalkers straight up. Alright, so again, the main focus of this deck is quick and cheap vampires, so the majority of our vampires are going to be in those 1 and 2 drop slots. But let's go through some of our slightly bigger threats. In tactic number 4, 3 for 3. Arrogant Bloodlord is a 4/4 for 3, which is an amazing rate. The only downside though is that if he's ever touched by a creature with 1 power, he dies. So we just gotta be smart about who we're attacking with this guy and we'll be fine. Then there's Vampire Nighthawk, who has some amazing keyword abilities. He's got Flying, Death Touch, and Lifelink. So not only are we going to gain a lot of life just by swinging with him, but he's also an excellent blocker when we need him to be because of that Death Touch. And finally, we've got Pawn of Ulamog, which just gives us even more creatures. Whenever Pawn of Ulamog or another one of our non-token creatures dies, we can create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token that we can sacrifice for mana. These guys make excellent blockers and even sources of mana for us. On top of that, we have some cards that drain our opponents whenever one of our creatures dies, so this comes in huge. Now, casting all these creatures is great and all, but we want to make sure that we don't run out of gas too quick. So let's go on to tactic number 5, keep it going. Skull Clamp is perhaps our best source of draw in this deck. For the small price of 1 mana and losing one of our vampire creature tokens, we just get to draw 2 cards. Seeing as in this will help us draw into more vampires, cast them, and get more vampire creature tokens, this is an excellent engine for this deck. Then we've got Dust Legion Zealot, which when it comes into play we get to draw a card and we lose 1 life, but it's worth the cost. Next up is Asylum Visitor, which can provide us with a lot of value in the right circumstances. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, if that player has no cards in hand, we get to draw a card and lose a life. On top of that, it's got Madness, so if we can discard it with one of those effects we talked about earlier, it can be some extra value for us. Next up, there's Sign and Blood, which is an excellent draw spell in this deck. It's going to make someone draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. Read the Bones is going to be very similar, but it's going to let us scry 2 first. Next up, there's Siphon Mine, which is going to make all of our opponents discard a card, which means we usually get to draw 3 cards. Ambition's Cost and Ancient Craving are the exact same thing. We'll draw 3 cards and lose 3 life. And finally, there's Champion of Dusk, which can draw us a ton of cards at once. Again, we're going to be swarming the board with this deck. We're going to cast a ton of cheap vampires, so we can have upwards of 10 vampires on the battlefield. When Champion of Dusk comes into play, we'll draw X cards and lose X life, where X is the number of vampires we control. Again, there are plenty of ways for us to gain that life back, so that's not that big of a deal, and being able to draw a ton of cards at once is a huge benefit. But having a ton of tiny vampires on the field won't always do us much good, so let's go on to tactic number 6, Team Spirit. Again, outside of Edgar's attack trigger, we have plenty of ways to pump our team. Stromkirk Condemned has discard a card, vampires you control get +1/+1 until the end of the turn. Now, unfortunately, we can only activate this once a turn, but it's still a great effect for this deck. Then there's Olivia, Mobilized for War. When one of our creatures enters the battlefield, we can discard a card, and then it will get a +1/+1 counter, and it gets haste. This can be huge for us later in the game when one of our big threats comes into play and we want to give it haste and make it bigger right away. Then there's Mere Entity, which is a shapeshifter, but technically a vampire since it has Changeling. When it's on the battlefield, we can pay X, and until the end of the turn, creatures we control have a base power and toughness of XX and gain all creature types. This guy's going to make it very hard for our opponents to know how to block us. And when our opponents don't block us, our creatures are going to benefit from things like Rakish Air and Stensia Masquerade. Both have that whenever a vampire we control deals combat damage to a player, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on it. On top of that, Stensia Masquerade is also going to give our attacking creatures first strike, and it even has Madness. But now let's get on to the Golden Pig, which is the best card out of the 99 in this deck. Indulgent Aristocrat may not seem like much at first, but he is definitely the Golden Pig for this deck. Indulgent Aristocrat is a 1/1 lifelinker for 1 mana. And he has the incredible ability of pay 2, sacrifice a creature, put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. Again, with this deck, we'll have a ton of sacrifice fodder with all those vampire tokens that we'll have. This guy can pump our team out of nowhere. And if one of our creatures is going to be removed or will die in combat, we can just pay 2 to sacrifice them instead and pump the team instead of just losing them for nothing. Indulgent Aristocrat can make even our smallest creatures into giant beaters in the blink of an eye. And that's why he's a huge threat to our opponents and the Golden Pig of the deck. Next up, we're running 3 Vampire Lords, which will each pump our vampires by +1/+1. Legion Lieutenant will do just that, but he only costs 2 mana to get out. Stromkirk Captain's going to do that as well, but it's also going to give all of our vampires first strike. And Captivating Vampire does that, but we can also tap 5 vampires we control to gain control of target creature, and it's going to become a vampire in addition to its other types. Other than Indulgent Aristocrat, Captivating Vampire is probably our biggest threat in the deck. Bloodlord of Vazagoth is a pretty big threat in this deck as well. Not only does he have Bloodthirst 3 on his own, but he also gives all of our other vampire creatures that we cast Bloodthirst 3. This means that if we dealt damage to our opponent in a turn, and then we cast a vampire, they come into play with 3 +1/+1 counters. Again, this is a very aggressive deck, so we'll be attacking a lot and damaging our opponents plenty. Outside of attacking, there are other ways that we can kill our opponents though. Let's go through some of those ways now in tactic number 7, this is draining. Sanctum Seeker is going to give us some more value whenever we attack with a vampire. For each vampire that we attack with, each of our opponents is going to lose 1 life, and we'll gain 1 life. With this deck, that can add up quickly. Then there's Malakir Blood Witch, which is an absolute bomb in this deck. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent's going to lose life equal to the number of vampires we control, and then we gain life equal to the total life lost that way. It's not uncommon for this deck to have more than 10 vampires on the battlefield at a time. So when we cast Malakir Blood Witch, this is a huge life swing. Finally, we're running Blood Artist and Falkenrath Noble, and they're pretty much the exact same card minus the mana cost. They have whenever they or another creature dies, target player is going to lose 1 life and we gain 1 life. The great thing about this, though, is that it applies to all creatures and not just ours. So whenever one of our opponents has a creature that dies, we benefit from it. And we're even running some sacrifice outlets in this deck that can help us finish off an opponent whenever we want. Let's go through those now in tactic number 8, Sacrilegious. Bloodthrone Vampire, Vampire Aristocrat, and Blood Baron are all very similar. Basically, they each allow you to sacrifice a creature to give them +2/+2 until the end of the turn. The only difference with Blood Baron, though, is that you can only sacrifice another creature, she can't sacrifice herself. Then there's Bloodflow Connoisseur, which has sacrifice a creature, put a +1/+1 counter on it. All of these creatures that sacrifice others to pump themselves are very effective in combat. They make it very hard for our opponents to determine who to block and who to block with. Next up is Yahenni Undying Partisan, which gets bigger every single time an opponent's creature dies. We can also sacrifice another creature to give it indestructible until the end of the turn. Yahenni can get huge and out of hand quickly just by being on the battlefield. And finally there's Falkenrath Aristocrat, which is a 4/1 with flying and haste, and we can sacrifice a creature to give it indestructible. So we've talked about sacrificing our own creatures, but let's talk about now dealing with some of our opponents. It's time to go on to tactic number 9, Bloodthirst. Dark Imposter has an incredible ability late game. We can pay 4 black to exile target creature and put a +1/+1 counter on it. And on top of that, Dark Imposter has all the activated abilities of all creature cards exiled with it. So not only can this guy help get rid of our opponent's biggest threats, but he can also become a huge threat to our opponents. Then there's Valdarin Pariah, who may cost 5 mana, but does have a madness cost of black. At any time, we can sacrifice 3 other creatures in order to transform her. When she transforms into Abolisher of Bloodlines, we're going to make target opponent sacrifice 3 creatures. Again, with this deck, we have a ton of sacrifice fodder with all of our vampire tokens, but our opponents might not be so lucky. Finally, there's Anawan the Ruin Sage. It has, at the beginning of your upkeep, each player has to sacrifice a non-vampire creature. Now this won't hurt us at all, but it will be detrimental to our opponents. So now that we've talked about dealing with some of our opponents' threats, let's talk about dealing with some of the other things our opponents might do. Let's go into tactic number 10, Dire Circumstances. A board wipe can be very detrimental to us. So having something like Rootborn Defenses or Make a Stand to give all of our creatures indestructible is huge. On top of that, Rootborn Defenses is going to let us populate, so we'll get another vampire token. And Make a Stand will give our creatures +1/+0 until the end of the turn so that they can be more effective blockers or attackers. If we need to get any of our big vampires out of our graveyard and back onto the battlefield, Bloodline Necromancer is the card to do it. And on top of that, it's a 3/2 lifelinker, which isn't too bad itself. Finally, we're running Mortify and Utter End, which are both just really good ways to deal with a variety of cards. Mortify will let us destroy target creature or enchantment, and Utter End will just straight up exile target non-land permanent. This deck is fast, powerful, and a lot of fun to pilot. If our opponents don't have some early responses, we can easily run away with the game. But now that we've gone through all the cards in this deck that help us win, let's go through the cards that help make it happen. It's time to go on to the mana base. We're going to be running 35 lands in this deck, including Nomad Outpost, which enters the battlefield tapped. It can tap for any of our colors. Scoured Barrens is going to enter the battlefield tapped and gain us 1 life, and it can tap for either a white or black mana. Then there's Tainted Field, which taps for colorless, but if we control a swamp, it can tap for either white or black. Akuum Refuge and Bloodfell Caves come into play tapped, gain us a life, and tap for either black or red. When Aether Hub enters the battlefield, we'll gain an energy, and we can use that energy to add 1 mana of any color, or we can tap for a colorless. Then we're running 3 Panoramas, including Jund, Grixis, and Esper. Each can tap for a colorless, or we can pay 1 to tap and sacrifice them to search for 1 of 2 basic lands. Finally, we're going to be running 26 basic lands in this deck, including 20 swamps, 3 mountains, and 3 plains. And now that we've gone through every single card in the deck, let's do a quick price check. As always, the cost of Commander's Quarters decks are calculated using TCG player optimization, optimizing with even heavily played and damaged cards because those cards need a home too. The average Edgar Markov EDH rec deck is going to set you back $190.69. Let's see how we compare to that. Our deck is going to be much more affordable at $24.95. Now again, our Commander's Quarters decks are built to be tuned and focused within that $25 budget, but there are always ways that we can improve on them. Let's go through some reasonable upgrades to see what some of those ways just might be. Harsh Mercy comes in at $3.72. Harsh Mercy is a sorcery that costs 2 and a white, and it says, each player chooses a creature type. Destroy all creatures that aren't of a type chosen this way, they can't be regenerated. This is a card that doesn't affect us at all, but will be detrimental to most of our opponents. Then there's Bloodline Keeper that costs $7.55. Bloodline Keeper is a 3/3 flyer that costs 2 black. He has tap, put a 2/2 black vampire creature token with flying onto the battlefield. And once we control 5 or more vampires, we can pay black to transform him. He transforms into Lord of Lineage and will give all of our other vampire creatures +2/+2. He also retains the ability to tap to put a vampire in play. Lord of Lineage is perhaps the best effect out of all the lords that we have. In each turn, he can basically create a 4/4 flying vampire. Then we have Anointed Procession, which comes in at $5.14. Anointed Procession is an enchantment that costs 3 and a white, and it says if an effect would create 1 or more tokens under your control, it creates twice that many tokens instead. So anytime we cast a vampire, we're going to get 2 tokens off of Edgar's trigger. As you can probably guess, this gets out of hand very quickly. Then there's Metallic Mimic, which costs $4.95. Metallic Mimic is a 2/1 shapeshifter that costs 2. When it comes into the battlefield, we're going to choose vampires. On top of it becoming a vampire, whenever another vampire comes into the battlefield, it comes into play with a +1/+1 counter. This applies to both vampires that we cast and to tokens. Then there's Cathar's Crusade, coming in at $2.61. It's an enchantment that costs 3 white and says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. With this deck, this enchantment can make our team huge in no time. Finally, there's Patron of the Vein at $1.19. It's a 4/4 flying vampire shaman that costs 4 black. It has, when it enters the battlefield, we get to destroy target creature an opponent controls, and whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, we exile it and put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire we control. So this guy can not only pump our team, but it also throws a wrench in certain graveyard strategies. This deck is very powerful, and with some of these reasonable upgrades, it becomes even stronger. But I really just want to hear about what you guys think about the deck, so why don't you let me know in the comments below. Also, make sure you're following us on both Twitter and Facebook so you can get some early hints on who the next commander just might be. Links to the Commander's Quarters Twitter and Facebook can be found in the description below. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron of the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a new general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. If you enjoyed this deck tech, please like it and subscribe to the channel. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again and have a good one.